We're going to get started. Thank you for all being here today. Welcome to Startup Week. How's everybody feeling? Good? All right. So this session is Strengthening Arts Infrastructure in Detroit. My panelists are Taylor Aldridge of ARTS.BLACK, Arder of Creative Many, Melvin Henley of the Detroit Creative Corridor Center, John Dones of Studio Teal, Rula David of Interstate Gallery and 1X Run, and Michael Stone Richards of Detroit Research Journal. As you all know, there are over 150 events here at Detroit Startup Week, and they are all free. So we only have to thank our sponsors for this: Chase, Ford, Opportunity Detroit, Microsoft, Telemis, Bill Highway, Liquor 43, Pioneer Homes, Pixo Group, Motor City Match, the Detroit Chamber of Commerce, Soldia, the Social Enterprise Alliance Detroit, Very, and But So Long. It is my honor and absolute pleasure to introduce this fantastic group of people that have gathered here today to give you their expertise on the city of Detroit and the arts community here. They represent an incredible cross-sector who all play crucial roles in the creative ecosystem right now. All of them are either in companies that are creative startups at different stages, or they work directly with arts-focused creative individuals and companies. So I'll give you a brief history, a little bit more about each panelist. Next to me is Michael Stone Richards. He is the beloved professor in critical theory and visual studies at the College for Creative Studies, and he's also the co-founder of Detroit Research, which is a new journal for practice and artist research for exploring social practice, ceramics, choreography, music, performance, and critical theory in Detroit. Next to him is Arder. She is an artist and cultural strategist and producer for Creative Many. She has also piloted a new program with Creative Many called Make Plus Do, which she'll go into a little bit more later. Her artistic practice uses a combination of handmade and found materials to create sculptural objects and installations that explore the relationship between people, objects, and place. She was also in a group show at Pops Packing recently in Hamtramck. Next to her, we have John Dones. He's the founder and creative director and brand strategist of Studio Teal, and also a nightlife designer, one half of Hote to Death with his partner Ash Noack, which includes DJing and event consulting. Next to John, we have Taylor Aldridge. She's the co-founder of ARTS.BLACK, which is a Detroit-based journal of art criticism from Black perspectives, which was founded in 2015. Next to her, we have Rula David. She's currently the COO of 1X Run, the gallery director of Interstate, and also the festival director of Murals in the Market. She also helped establish the Red Bull House of Art. And Interstate Gallery is based in Eastern Market. They work with both established and emerging artists. They have two exhibition spaces, a residency program, a print studio, and their publishing company. And finally, last but not least, we have Melvin Henley, who works at the Detroit Creative Corridor. He is the program manager of the newly created program called Creative Co., and he comes to DC3 from the Detroit Revitalization Fellows Program. So thank you and welcome panelists. Thanks for being here. So I wanted to kick off our conversation with a quote. Here I go. I think of artists like scientists. We artists know that if we join the thousands of other artists asking rigorous questions, that the world will change. It always has. These two methods work on different things. The scientific method works on material questions. The artistic process works on questions of culture and questions of thought. Today, especially in a developed world, many of our toughest problems are questions of thought and culture. Artists are the only people who contribute new knowledge to the cultural realm. Others can redefine, popularize, or synthesize this research, but it is them that discovers new cultural information. And that is a sacred responsibility. We live in a time when we are inundated by images, pictures, language, videos, stories, and music, and bodies. 99% of those images were made for one reason, which is to get you to buy something. And artists are responsible for that tiny sliver of images that can be made for every other possible reason. Cultural, spiritual, political, emotional, and in an age of an image overload, this is to be taken seriously. These are the two most robust processes for problem-solving methodologies that have ever been developed. Take one away and our world would be unrecognizable. And that was from Andrew Simonet from Making Your Life as an Artist. Now, before we get started, I just wanted to define a few words that we're going to be talking about so that we're all on the same page here. So art. So these are for the purpose of this conversation. Art is a range of human activities to create visual, auditory, performing artifacts, artworks that express the creator's imagination of technical skill, to be appreciated for its beauty or power. This also includes other aspects such as production of artwork, the criticism of art, the study of the history, and its aesthetic review. It can be something that's created with your imagination or skill, and that is beautiful, that expresses important ideas or feelings. And those are from Webster and Wikipedia. Now, arts infrastructure. What is arts infrastructure? For this conversation, we are going to define that as councils, boards, arts facilitation, housing, studio, subsidies, policy, tourism planning, co-working spaces, art promotion, funding procurement, industry partnerships, and education. And I take this information from a lecture that John Dones and Dominic Arnello put together for Break and Build, which actually the title of the lecture was, coincidentally, Strengthening Arts in Infrastructure in Detroit. So thank you for already defining those terms. And I want to also contrast that to arts ecosystem. So there's infrastructure and there's ecosystem. The ecosystem is defined as artists, producers, facilitators, administrators, foundations, museums, galleries, collectors, patrons, schools, government, and policymakers. So the creative economy, almost $2.5 billion is spent on arts and culture tourism, reported by Creative Many, which is about 18% of the state's tourism revenue. At this point, now artists and creatives have more time and tools to put their work out there, self-represent on social media, have Etsy stores online. And so the role of the artist is becoming something more of a creative entrepreneur. So I want to ask all of you a little bit more about your own work. So what does your creative work look like to you? When do you know that you've been successful or done the best job on an initiative, a project, or work for client? I think it's often that people don't quite understand what creative work really means. So anyone who'd like to start, feel free.
Someone with a microphone in their hand. Do you want to go down?
Sure, you can go that way. Hi, everyone. I just want to say happy to be involved on the panel, so thanks for having me, and thanks for attending. So in response to the question about what does creative work look like, is that right? So that's a tough one to define because for my work, I work for Detroit Creative Corridor Center, and so a lot of the work that we do is particularly around designers and also branching out into artists who may not always identify with themselves as being designers and whatnot. So a lot of the work that we do in my work specifically is how can we create systems for people who are operating in this space to be able to take the next step in the work that they're doing, who, for example, someone that's like a website designer, is an artist in and of themselves because they are, designing a website, they're, figuring out pictures that has to go on there, figuring out the feel, figuring out, the space and the colors and all of that stuff. And how do we allow them to take the next step in terms of growing their business, being able to become established, and then, connecting them to the ecosystem or connecting them to the proper infrastructures so they can continue to thrive and take the next steps. So we're doing a lot of the kind of early touch work of reaching out and identifying these people to say, hey, we're advocates for you. Allow us to promote all of the great work that you're doing in this space and being able to, take the next step forward. And then being able to come back and report these things to, the various bodies, if it's like Creative Mini or Culture Source, or to the city government to say all of these things are happening, in Detroit, how we're not getting excited about it. Like it's our role to be as excited about it and tell others who may be at like CCS or like a Lawrence Tech that there are opportunities for you. So that's a lot of the work that we're doing.
Hey everyone, thanks Paulina for having us. So creative work, I think, what creative work is maybe in what we do at Interstate or 1X Run is really like collaborations and offering opportunities to artists. So when someone asks me like, what do you feel like when you feel like satisfied about the job that you do or what you had done that was successful, it was really seeing a project through with an artist, whether it's a product or whether it's a client job, and it coming into being exactly what the artist visualized and saw as being something that they wanted to happen or something that they wanted to create. So for me, that's like my personal satisfaction in the work that we do. And we'll probably get into it a little bit deeper, but ultimately like collaborations and creative thought in regards to like crossing bridges between artists, collectors, and clients is really where it's at.
Hello everyone, again my name is Taylor Renee Aldridge. Thank you Paulina for having me today. My work, I'm the co-founder of ARTS.BLACK, which is an online arts journal prioritizing criticism from Black perspectives exclusively. And my work in general, I have a background in art history and museum studies, but I'm really concerned with sort of representation within the general arts industry, the global arts industry, and the lack of ethnic and cultural representation that plagues the industry. So a lot of it is just wanting to see people that look like me, people of color who aren't really necessarily, who are operating on the periphery of this greater arts industry and haven't been included historically in the writing and the making of the infrastructure of the global arts industry. And so I'm interested in basically providing counter-narrative to what we're used to seeing in the greater arts industry. ARTS.BLACK is a global arts publication, but I live in Detroit, I'm from Detroit, and a lot of the work that I do is influenced by what's happening on the ground here. So I'm thinking globally, me and my partner are thinking globally, but acting locally within our respective regions. And I think the impact that I didn't really anticipate with creating a platform like ARTS.BLACK is that we're filling a huge void, and it's just me and my partner, two Black women in our 20s, and we just wanted to create something that we thought was missing from the landscape. But ultimately we're serving as a connector for larger arts publications to find writers of color for their publication. So people like Art News, just these larger art newspaper are coming to ARTS.BLACK to find Black critics. So we're really serving as a resource, and I think that's been like a huge impact that I just could have never predicted. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, that's my work.
Hey, what's up, everyone? My name's John Dones. Paulina, thanks for having me. What is my creative work? I'm creative, so when I'm working on things, it's just part of my skill set and my strength, I do strategy. Long story short, I got from an arts background into strategy through creative direction and design, and I'm also a DJ. So like everything I do is just happens to be a creative approach. And I do think that, you know, we need to allow creatives who might have a more nebulous background or lack of entity or job title to participate in other spheres. And that's sort of success to me is, you know, being able to actually get a seat at the table in some of these other conversations where typically me as a creative person wouldn't, you know, have the opportunity. Pauline and I've worked on a number of things like a transit conference last year where we brought a bunch of creative minds around issues in transit. That to me is creative work, and it needs to happen more in the city. So success to me is, you know, being able to bring creativity to the table in places where it's desperately needed. Success to me is being able to pay the bills and, you know, figure out, you know, live a life of ambiguity, you know, like as a creative in this capacity, you know, there's a lot of, you know, people want a little box that they can say, oh, you are X, Y, Z, I understand that, and I will hire you for X, Y, Z job. And when you just live A, B, C, D, X, Y, Z, you know, success is getting, you know, viability in your career. So, and I also, I like helping other people in my similar disposition to succeed in some of the ways that I have succeeded. So their success is my success is their success. That's where I'm coming from.
Thanks, John.
Hi everyone, I'm Ash. I have a lot of different hats, but so sometimes I'll answer from different ones. For this one, I'll do two.
Dull, so repetitive, boring work that makes work I want to shoot myself work. What other kind of work is there that anyone, because by the way, nobody puts up their hands and say, yes, I volunteer, I want to do dull, repetitive, boring, shoot yourself work. Nobody does that. So what other kind of work is there if it is not creative work? And one of the ways in which I therefore see this kind of conversation, if we can now be reflexive or meta, if you want to say, is that in fact, what these kinds of conversations represent is that both in Detroit and in our society, we are in the process of a transition, right? We're in the process of a transition where the very idea of work is being redefined, where ideas of leisure are being redefined, and part of the crisis that we're going through culturally and economically, our ideas of social wealth are also in the process of being redefined. If the artist, quote unquote, has any special function, which I don't believe that they do, if they do, the artist is the person who has this extraordinary luxury. And by the way, I think luxury is a necessary part of life. The luxury of free time. The time to think. The time, in other words, to be outside of a type of existence that is entirely dominated by need or by anxiety, right? To be able to live outside of anxiety and need, that is an extraordinary privilege. It is an extraordinary luxury, quote unquote, in contemporary society. If you have that luxury, then what you do is creative in thinking. And it doesn't matter at one level whether you make things with that. The artist then becomes the kind of thinker who has the resources, the mental resources, the social resources, to be able to think critically about their role in society. And that's why I say someone like a Joseph Beuys, many years ago in the late 60s, early 70s, said, jeder Mensch ist ein Künstler. Every person is an artist, because in the end, It's the act of creative participation that defines the artist, not the kind of thing or object that they make. So I want to say, creative work, what else should we be doing if it's not creative work? Infrastructure, we're part of a civil society. We're essentially arguing for a new notion of what civil society might be. And the artist, for me, is a thinker of a certain kind who has the leisure to think about things outside of need, outside of anxiety, which means potentially all of us should be in that position.
Emma, sorry, you've touched on a lot of good things that we are going to circle back to. And on the note of the role of a global citizen and Detroit being a global city, I know that I think most or all of you have lived elsewhere at some point. And I would like to, as we start to talk more about arts infrastructure in Detroit, make a quick comparison to either another place that you've lived. Ash travels across the state of Michigan and maybe can make some comparisons to Grand Rapids. Just a brief thought on a comparison, either a contrast or something that you can put Detroit into the context of. I can start with.
Okay, so sure. Immediately, what jumps out is the program that Paulina referenced earlier, which is Make Plus Do, which is a pilot project that we launched last fall through Creative Many. And so basically what it allowed us to do is create a cross-geographical cohort of makers who I hope we're including in this arts conversation today. I know they don't usually fit neatly within the art topic, but so basically we gathered half of the makers from Detroit and half from Grand Rapids, and rather than, when we were conceptualizing this program, there was an opportunity. The funding was from the National Endowment for the Arts, and really there was an opportunity to do 2 separate, 3 separate, 4 separate projects. But what we had found in doing sort of information sessions about what the needs and challenges and opportunities were for makers is that there were things that Grand Rapids makers and designers, for example, there were things that they were experiencing, issues that they were experiencing that Detroiters were too, right? And so that kind of comes from me kind of having to be knowledgeable about each ecosystem. With that, I have way too many things in my head all the time, but sometimes I'm able to make parallels. And so there's a specific community in Grand Rapids that is in the Hartside neighborhood, and they're using mixed-use retail space to kind of give subsidized housing to creative people. And so Dwelling Place Grand Rapids is the organization that spearheads this, and what they do is they allow artists, designers, makers, entrepreneurs to live on site, either upstairs or in the back of their shop, and then have retail space or shop space in the front or in the bottom level. You apply for that program, you live there until you reach a certain, until you kind of, I won't say age out, but you start making too much money, which is, I guess, a good thing if your business is so successful that you don't need to pay that amount. But anyway, so that was happening there. In Detroit, a lot of the makers were expressing sort of conflict about being pushed out of their spaces or not having the capital to be able to rent certain spaces or be in districts where there was a wealth of other makers making things. So immediately in my mind, I connected it with what was happening in Hartside in Grand Rapids, and thought, rather than having 2 separate programs operating separately, what would it look like to have them all be together and do an immersive kind of cross-city program? So that was a specific kind of, I mean, obviously there are other differences and similarities, which were hashed out during this immersive kind of 6-day program. They spent the night in Grand Rapids, and then all the Grand Rapids makers came to Detroit and spent the night in Detroit. Yeah, it was really just an opportunity to have a conversation about space, mixed use, access, real estate, ownership, rentership, role in community, that really was motivated by the fact that each of these places does have some intersection, and let's lean into that a little bit rather than trying to keep it siloed.
I moved here 5 years ago from Cincinnati, Ohio, another Midwestern city, a little bit smaller. But if you wanted to talk about like what's the difference between, let's say, the creative environment or like the artistic environment or ecosystem or infrastructure of Detroit to a city like Cincinnati, which is also rich in culture. I mean, they've got a ballet, they've got an opera, they've got multiple museums, a beautiful museum designed by Zaha Hadid. The difference is that creative thought or creative entrepreneurship does not happen there. Like, it's all completely foundation-based. It's completely like rigid and uninteresting and uninspiring. They actually do public art in Cincinnati, and it's a program through Artworks, it's called. And so what they do is they have graphic designers design these murals, and then they have a community of like Cincinnati youth that they pay to paint the murals. It takes anywhere from 4 to 6 months, right? If you go and you see them, they're like, oh, it's cool. It's like things that depict Cincinnati or depict the community that it's in, but it doesn't depict maybe that artist's expression of like who they are and what they want to be and the freedom to do and express what they want. So when I moved here, the one thing that really kind of struck me that was different than there was the fact that every artist, every, let's say, creative or musician, or it just seeps out of like the corners here. And everyone is always trying to figure out how they're gonna make it to be, make it to be like what they're super passionate about. I had a friend that visited me once from Cincinnati, and she worked in like the hospitality industry, and she's like, I didn't meet one person in Detroit that had a real job when she visited me. I was like, what do you mean you didn't meet one person that had a real job? She's like, I met a DJ, and I met a couple of artists, and I was like, those are jobs. So imagine like the mentality that actually is a hobby, or that's something that you do, like you have to have something else. But what I noticed is these people did have other jobs, right? So they did maybe serve in a restaurant or bartended, but they identified themselves, their predominant job, and the predominant person that they were was an artist, a DJ, a sculptor, a gallery owner. I mean, we have a young guy that used to work for us, and he just opened a gallery in his stairwell of his house in Southwest Detroit. You know what I mean? It's literally in a stairwell. So the idea of like how people are entrepreneurial in thought and entrepreneurial in creative thought, as I always go back to that, it's very prevalent here in Detroit, way different than a lot of like Midwestern or smaller cities throughout the country.
I'm thinking in contrast, I lived in other cities. I lived in New York, I lived in Cambridge, Boston, I lived in Washington, D.C. But most recently, I just came back from a residency in Miami. And I was living in Miami, not South Beach. I really wasn't enjoying the beach. Just doing research, because I've found that in previous visits that there's a lot of similarities between Detroit and Miami as far as infrastructure goes, or lack thereof. There's a lot of art being made in these cities, but not a lot of foundations or institutional support to really help these ecosystems thrive, help, supporting these artists. And one of the main things I think we talk about, like, oh, Detroit needs more money, we need more of a collector base to support these artists, so on and so forth. But what I found in Miami is that there's a lot of money, there's a lot of wealth in Miami, but there's really no incentive for these wealthy patrons to invest in the greater arts ecosystem, right? There's a large collector base, a lot of this wealth, it's seasonal. They only live in Miami for a few seasons out of the year, so there's no real incentive to invest in the broader ecosystem, because they're not really interested in investing in the Miami overall. But I just thought that was interesting, because there's this like misconception in Miami, like with Basel and the art fairs, that there's a lot of money here. There's a lot of collectors that live in Miami, but that doesn't necessarily always transfer or translate into the greater arts ecosystem. And I also found that artists feel conflicted. Artists living in Miami feel conflicted because they feel the need to create work that sells, because they're constantly, in dialogue or in the presence of collectors who have the money, who are willing to buy artwork for their collections. But these artists also want to experiment. They also want to have space to think and challenge their aesthetic practices. So I found like that was really interesting. There's still a lack of infrastructure in Miami. And even though I've never lived there, I just thought that the parallels are different, or similar rather. And maybe we shouldn't be so much thinking about a collector base, but something that's a bit more diplomatic and sort of like a shared economy.
That's really interesting.
Well, to touch on Miami, I mean, if you want to talk about Art Basel or the art fairs, which is really like the influx of when collectors come to Miami, we show, I think it's been 2 or 3 years in a row that we show down there at one of the art fairs. It's basically New York and Miami. I mean, people in Miami aren't really the biggest collectors, and some do, but it's not really like their thing. They get excited, they buy a couple of small pieces, but really what Art Basel is a bunch of New Yorkers that are trying to get out of the cold, and they go to Miami, and then they kind of take over the city for a little bit, and then they go right back to New York before the weekend even hits. That's kind of the way that it works. And we work with a lot of artists from Miami with One Time Run and Interstate Gallery, where we've shown them, and they do fight so hard that week to have visibility, right? And it's like, how as an artistic institution in Detroit, do you avoid those kind of scenarios where local artists are trying to fight through to have their voice in a community where there's lots of artists trying to come in and be a part of it? So it's really the responsibility of gallery owners and community leaders to really say, like, we have to include everybody in this process. And I think that's something that they've really missed out in Miami. And they really missed out in the fact that they can showcase a really unique voice of Latin American and South American artists that is a critical part of their community. Mm-hmm. And they miss that whole kind of boat. So yeah, I mean, I'm very much in agreement with Taylor just from spending time down there.
Thank you, Rilla. I'm just going to have John quickly answer, and then we're going to move on to the next question.
Yeah, and I think what Taylor brought up about the incentive to invest in infrastructure is a super interesting question, and incentives in general. So, my Detroit, New York connection is, when I lived there, I happened to fall into a situation where I worked for this very famous artist and had this moment in time, a few months, where I was working in a very sort of what you would consider an elite sphere of the art world, and it was fascinating. And I came back to Detroit having sort of had that experience and seen all of the players and the museum people and the collectors and the whole inside or behind the curtain of the industry of it, and understood a little bit more the psychology and the incentives that drive it. And coming back to Detroit, where, again, there's that lack of infrastructure, there's lack of collector base, there's lack of those same incentives that drive the art world in places like New York, and came back and saw a lot of my artist friends sort of following the let's make our own gallery, let's show our work on the wall and try and connect to question mark collector base. And so the incentives for artists were very different. I saw a lot of effort, a lot of time and own money and resources and favors and all of these things being poured into trying to do what they do in New York, but not really getting anything back, not getting press, not getting their work sold, not connecting to a market in a meaningful way. And so, it's like, what are the incentives here to pursue an art career? And my journey through that question has led me to what a few of us have set up here, is that we have the opportunity to try new things, to create new models to sustain ourselves as artists, to sustain an ecosystem of art. I think One Time Run absolutely is an example of that, and there are many different ways to explore these new models, and that's exactly where we're at right now in this time and place, and why we're having this conversation. So that's me.
Perfect. All right, so let's bring it a little bit back to Detroit. I want to talk to Melvin, DC3, and working working in DC3. What do you know about Detroit and the creative economy here? Any developments recently? I want you to also talk about the UNESCO City of Design designation, which I think could have some exciting implications to be explored.
Indeed. I think just like some immediate like adjectives that just pop into my head when thinking of like the creative space in Detroit is that it's amazing. Like it's world class. You know, you have individuals who are operating in this space who can compete with anyone and everyone, not just in the Midwest, but on either of the coast or at the top of the country or at the bottom of the country. And like they're located in Detroit or in and around Detroit. And sometimes like I think people forget that. A lot of the work we do as an economic development organization is we work with companies, and they're like, oh, we need to go to like Boston to get something done. We need to go to New York or Chicago. And it's like, but why? You can keep those dollars like in Detroit. And so it's a struggle to kind of get people to realize the level of professionalism and the level of the work that's already located in the city. Some other things that kind of pop into my mind is everyone's like, people who are operating in the space are really creative and are able to tell a different story, or able to communicate a different narrative that relates to a number of people, which always isn't just like, a very, it's a unique story, I think is what I'm getting at. And people are very collaborative. Through my work in the city, people are able to reach out to someone who's also in the space and kind of bring them on board to say, hey, John, I know you have this show coming up. Have you ever thought about working with this light designer? We know some. We'll happy to pass on their contact information to say, hey, we know a photographer who might be willing to, shoot your event. And we also know someone who's like a writer who can then pass that on. And then all those people are willing to, have a conversation with John and be able to say, hey, you're doing this, but how can we also elevate this event or like this work and all the stuff that you're doing in this space, which is amazing because that doesn't always happen. Similar to everyone else, like I've had experiences on the East Coast where it's very cutthroat out there. Like, people don't talk to each other. Like you ask them what's going on, they'll be like nothing when, they've got events and stuff here, but people are happy and excited and willing to have that conversation, which is amazing, and it's not seen elsewhere. But I think on the flip side of that, some of the areas where the space can struggle is kind of lacking that sustainability that comes into it, because you have a lot of people who may be like artists and stuff that's starting out, and it's kind of like a flash in the pan. They're kind of like new and exciting, but when it comes past that like 2-year mark, what are they doing now? Are they, resorting to picking up another job that, is very similar to what Mike is saying, that's very dull and very exciting, and that's kind of consumed their life because they're not able to continue to do what they want. But then also that intentionality that comes behind it. How are people being intentional in terms of either creating a pipeline through like CCS and other like LCU and others, people that operate in this space, to say, hey, we have these people who are right out of college or junior college, and how can we create a space, like a fertile environment, they're able to get the experience that they need and then take the next step. So it's that kind of like struggle at the same time that's taking place. And one of the stats I like to throw out when it comes to intentionality is that between 2010 and 2013, through like philanthropic dollars, both locally and nationally in Detroit, was over $55 million. And you're like, where's all that money going? All of these things are happening in various pockets of the city. How are the arts and culture community not banding together to say, how about we focus on the pipeline? How about we focus on these various aspects that kind of lead to an end goal of making the best possible city that there is. So I think that's some of the realizations that's come across in some of the conversations and the struggles of the artists that we've heard. So kind of coming back to your question about the UNESCO designation. So DC3, along with a number of city partners and planners, led the application process for Detroit to receive the UNESCO City of Design designation. So we are the first US city to receive the City of Design designation, which celebrates design and the impact of design in Detroit over the course of the next 10 years. There is no big check that comes with it, which is like, disappointing, and a lot of people have come call into us, and we're happy to answer, but we let them down gently. But it allows us to have, a number of conversations that we may not have been able to have in the past, and we're able to reach out to potential partners, reach out to a number of individuals to say, hey, we're being recognized not just regionally, not just locally, not just nationally, but internationally about the impact that's happening. What can we do to have very honest conversations about what's happening now, but also what's going to happen in the future, and how can we ensure that we're making Detroit the best city possible? For example, one of the conversations we're having is with individuals in the planning department to say, you have world-class designers, architects, urban planners. How are they not inputting or providing input to some of the projects and stuff that you're working on? And that's just they're like, that's a good idea. And I know Maurice is working hard, and they do have a design committee, a design review committee and stuff, but we're trying to work to elevate those things and promote them to the community, because there are things that's happening, but they need to be done a bit louder and a bit more proudly and stuff. So through this designation, that's what we're hoping to do and achieve. And there are going to be some additional announcements that's coming out about that moving forward.
That's great. Okay, so this is a big question, and I want to keep the conversation moving, so we'll just try to keep your answers as brief as possible. But why does art matter? Why does art matter in a city? What is the role of the art in the city? Why is art important to you? And what is really the value of arts?
This is my perspective on that, which is, we're in a city. What is the value of art? What's the value of having a population of artists in your city? And I'm of the perspective or persuasion that we're in a city that is perplexed with a lot of the issues and problems that not just face Detroit, but are bubbling up all over the world. And you've got an industry of people who are interested in the city. And as a creative person, you have more propensity to think about things in a different way. Everything becomes material. Everything has the potential for experimentation. And you can't, what's the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. I think the value of art isn't necessarily what is on the wall or what comes out of the studio or the products that get made, but it's having this population of people who fundamentally think differently about any given task or any given situation. That to me is what is interesting about our future. And I want to clarify too, it's not about solving problems. It's about art being a space that is safe for experimenting in new things. And whether it's a success or a failure, you can learn from those experiments, and art is a safe place to do that.
Pauline has asked the biggest question it's possible to ask, and then said, keep your answers brief. The first thing, there are very few things that are unequivocally universal in human culture. Art is one of them. Though anthropologists will say things like, well, what we call art, another culture may not necessarily call art. But we can say that art is fundamentally a form of expressive behavior that is culturally determined. That is absolutely universal. Anything that is universal is something that we are required to think about. Why is it universal? Why is it that even though it is demonstrably the case that more people will go to the ball game than will ever go to the DIA, nevertheless, it's the DIA that gets all the news, right? When we were talking a couple of years ago about the possibility of selling the DIA, that made world news in a way in which the closing of the Tiger Stadium absolutely would not make world news, and the closing of the Tiger Stadium would probably be an improvement of architecture in any case. So art is universal. Within the Western tradition, as this has grown up in, particularly since the 18th century, though it's been there from what some people would call the Renaissance, there's another feature that is extraordinarily important about art, and it is that art is fundamentally a form of play. Fundamentally, art is playfulness. When you look into the various theories of play, and of course, like anything else, there are lots and lots of different theories, there are a couple of things that they all agree on. One is that the opposite of play is not seriousness. You only need to look at children playing to realize that you can play and be terribly serious about it. And try interrupting a child when they're deep, deep in their play, and they're nasty little things. I know that. We all know that. The opposite of play is reality. There aren't many things that the theoreticians of play agree on, but those two things, they do agree, that play and seriousness can go together, but the opposite of play is reality. And the fundamental function, then, of art, which the Western tradition of the last 200 years, that is to say, since Romanticism, has emphasized, is to bring reality into question in some way. The other thing that happens with play, which is one of the reasons why I thought some of the discussions around selling the collection of the DIA were so utterly bizarre, and I see it in the social practice that has developed in Detroit. The other thing about play is that play is, in fact, a deep need. There's been a lot of work done both by philosophers such as Martha Nussbaum and the Indian thinker, economist Amartya Sen. Play is not a luxury. Art is not a luxury. And one might even go as far as to say, which I do publicly, point me to someone who cannot play, and I will point you to someone who is deeply damaged. Whether that person is a child or an adult doesn't matter. Someone who is not capable of behaving spontaneously, and to behave spontaneously in a way that is not driven, again, by purpose or need, right? It can be as basic as, be silly. Go on, be silly. Do something silly. Now, go on. It can be as simple as that, but play as a spiritual need says, there is a need we have to avoid acting always in terms of need. And within the Western tradition, art has come to be the embodiment of this idea. It's a very big idea. And it's a really strange thing to be able to say that something is powerful because it's, in a way, useless. But it's powerful, I think, because it's not to be identified, and here I agree with John, it's not to be identified. This is the mistake I think people make, and why the social practice scene in Detroit is both very important and annoying to some people. It is not to be identified with the making of things. This is a completely outdated idea of thinking about art. Art is a process, and it's a process now that is linked to the thing that is most important to all of us, which is life. Life itself is what is important. And you know what, guys? The first aesthetic experience, the word aesthetic comes from the Greek word for sensation, aesthesis. The first aesthetic experience that all of us have is not, in fact, of a work of art. The first aesthetic experience that anyone has is the experience first of being born, right? And aesthetic experience is fundamentally an experience of life itself. It is not about making. So we have this paradox that it is universal, it is incredibly important, but its importance rests on something very, very fragile and ultimately useless. And it's the uselessness that enables us then, the playfulness that enables us then to say, how do we talk about the things that are important to us? Because the things that are important to us, be it religion, be it culture, be it family, right? Take your pick, it doesn't matter. The things that are important to us don't ever fall under the category of need. So talking about art as opposed to just making it, thinking about what it is in fact another way of thinking about what is spiritually important to us. Thank you.
I'm going to move on. That was a really interesting take on art and play. And as the co-founder of Playground Detroit, I very much appreciate that sentiment because we are also very serious about our play. So how do we measure the impact of art, these art projects or these arts organizations or artists that don't have that traditional ROI, return on investment, dollar sign or number at the end of it? How is that leveraged in Detroit, and how do we measure the vibrancy that it brings to the city, whether through the online journals or actual displays, public murals, etc.? How do we measure that? Maybe Melvin or Ash, you can talk about that with your work through Creative Many.
Sure. So how do you measure? I think this goes back to some of what I was talking about earlier with there's no one size fits all, I think, for determining if something is valuable. And particularly within, I won't say art communities, I'll say creative communities. So what we have tried to do, again, is to look at each event or each initiative or each meeting as, yes, part of a larger whole to our work, but also as an individual happening that has those 10 or those 60 people in a room, and based on what they co-define with us as being successful or impactful, that is the marker by which we can measure. So sometimes if you don't know what it is that you are looking for, it's hard to create it's hard to create a measuring stick for it. So what is an example of that? Qualitative sort of methods or of understanding if something is impactful. So again, not just how many people showed up to something, but how many post-event or post-meeting collaborations happened after that, right? So yes, we do a lot of symposiums and a lot of conferences at a lot of places that you all know, but I think yes, those are important, but for us, what really, really is interesting is to see that when Creative Many has been removed from the picture, is Paulina collaborating with Taylor? Is Melvin collaborating with John? Are those conversations still happening without us? And you know, I think that that is a really powerful way for us to think about how qualitative sort of ideas can be used to build a framework in conjunction with quantitative, simply the numbers, how many people showed up, how much money was raised, how much money was spent, type of thing.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, I'm going to answer from two different hats. So just through my everyday work and the work that we do at DC3, you know, a lot of the ways that we answer this question is through the quantitative data. So it's like, how many new creative entrepreneurs have been touched? How many people have received services if it comes to like business support? How many questions did we answer? You know, things in that, which is fun in and of itself. It's sexy numbers for, you know, particular individuals and whatnot. But then, you know, you start to dig a little deeper and you say, like, how many people are we enabling to reach their dream? You know, this is something that people have thought about, you know, each and every day. How many times are we, you know, forging new collaborations? How many new conversations are we allowing the space allowing the space for conversations to take place in? And like it's interesting the responses that you hear to that, because some of the conversations that we're having, either if it's with, you know, the tourism and visitors board to say, hey, you know, the creative space is contributing to this and can be leveraged, you know, to help you achieve your goals. And they were like, oh, that's great and all, but like, what else can you show us? And you say, like, when you look to another of other examples and say, well, this is important because it does as an economic driver, and they're not always, able to listen to that as effectively as others. But I think a really great example that you can draw to is you can use art for a number of different things. So if it's art and public safety, art and education, art and community development, community relations, right? One example that I would like to draw on is like CPAT. So CPAT is Community and Arts Partnership in Detroit. CPAT, yeah, I think so. So they do a lot of public art displays and new developments and things. So one of the projects that they did in the community was they developed these two adult-sized children and put them outside of a library, and they were reading books and stuff like that. So originally it was kind of like, it's a thing, but people aren't really excited about it. But as the community became more invested in the project and started to really care about it, they really began to take ownership of this particular project. So the projects had been up, and they had to take away the heads for cleaning. So the community felt so attached to this project that they began calling, the police department to say, hey, all these people have been like destroying our art project because the heads were gone, or to say like, hey, there's something happening, things aren't right, or even calling to say, hey, there's these two kids left outside of the library after dark. You need to go and check on them, and stuff like that. So it's like these things that, you may not go into a room to say, like, leverage your resources, but you can say it's having an impact in the community, and it's something that you need to take notice of.
That's a beautiful transition. So how do we turn cultural capital into equity and ownership? Ownership of space, or ownership of your intellectual property. Also, what is cultural capital? It seems like there isn't a lot of hard capital necessarily in some spheres, especially post-bankruptcy or around that time. But what is cultural capital, and how is that leveraged into equity?
Well, that is the question, and that is why there is so much discussion in this city around art. It is the preeminent... Ladies and gentlemen, in every case, we are basically taking for granted the prestige of art. Art has prestige. It has cultural prestige. It has social prestige. And that's what we mean by cultural capital. And so we are essentially now saying, okay, urban gardening. Well, guess what? People have been doing urban gardening at one way of thinking forever. There's been always a very powerful black urban gardening scene in Detroit. But now, in the last, say, 10 years or so, people with MFAs in art have been doing urban gardening. And so now the cultural capital of art, the prestige attached to art, allows a new group of people to do things to get real capital, as you call it, and equity that others have not been able to do. When I look at, say, the Brightmoor Alliance, one of the things that I see going on in Brightmoor is that Brightmoor has basically said, oh, Detroit has got all of this attention and all of this real capital because they link everything to art. And Brightmoor Alliance is now doing something similar. So the whole social practice scene, and it's not only social practice, but also the real issue, and then I'll stop talking, is how do we get from the cultural capital to capital? That has been the problem forever. And I'm not sure what the solution would be, because that is a different question from the political question about the equitable access to resources, right? That's a political question, and that is something that can only be solved at the level of a society where we agree on what wealth is and how we can have access to social wealth as opposed to individual wealth. But essentially, we are having this conversation because art has an inbuilt prestige within our culture.
Just to kind of touch on, how do you change it from being cultural capitalism to real capitalism? I mean, what we do in our business, 1X Run has been around for about, I think, little over 5 years. We're going to close 5 years this year. And in 5 years, we've paid $5 million in artist commissions. We are independently funded. We have no board members. We are a group of artists and creatives in Detroit. We have employed over 19 Detroiters that work for us, where they're a mix of artists, musicians, DJs, accountants, like just people that really want to contribute to working in a creative space. And we create opportunities for artists to live full-time on what they do. We do have a handful of artists that we publish prints or have multiples or sell their artwork where they have been able to leave their jobs and have been able to just focus on their art. We focus on replications. So we are a publisher of fine art editions. But what we did that was different than maybe what a lot of people that are sitting here and kind of the way that we've contributed to it is we have merged with technology. So if you're an artist, I had somebody ask me the other day, they're like, my daughter is studying to be an artist. She's thinking of taking another major. What do you think what do you think she should take? And I was like, tell her to take marketing. You know what I mean? Like, tell her she needs to take a marketing class. She needs to learn how to use social media. She needs to learn how to send a newsletter. She needs to learn how to be her own business owner. You as an artist, you are your own entrepreneur, right? So you have to figure out a way to communicate what you're doing in today's technology and world. We have a website that's proprietarily owned. We're not like on any particular kind of like format, no Squarespace or any of the other ones. We have a chief technology officer that works with us in-house, and we try to make it exciting, and we try to do something fun and new, and we try to make it accessible. We sell art to people in Moscow and in Dubai and in London and Paris, and they have never been to Detroit. They barely even know where Detroit is, but they are helping 20 Detroiters keep their jobs every day. And all of it is done through the internet. And so from having 1X Run as being this broad mother company, parent company, let's say, we've been able to kind of separate some other projects that we do. So we have Interstate Gallery, which we predominantly sell on the internet also, but it's a gallery in Detroit where we show Detroit artists, we show international artists, national artists. We bring them into the city and kind of have them collaborate with different makers in the city. And we've contributed our gallery, or we've started forcing or pushing our gallery to be more of a community space. Because let's be honest, there's not enough collectors in Detroit. I know that I saw some talking points about why isn't there an Art Basel in Detroit or art fairs. There's just not, people aren't buying art. I mean, there's people buying art, but it's not at the level of a New York or Los Angeles or San Francisco. It's just not part of our culture just yet. I think there's a lot of new collectors that are coming online daily. We're seeing them. They start off by buying an album cover that's interesting, and then a movie poster, and then they buy their first piece of original art. I think we're seeing that being developed more. I think we're 20 years away from seeing something like that happen, but I think it can. And then how do we contribute in regards to like building what collectors are? Well, you have to go to the internet, and you have to sell your work, and you have to show in other places. And if people get stuck in the Detroit bubble, which I call it, you're going to get kind of hyper-focused or hyper concentrated on kind of unrealistically where the collector is. And then from Interstate and 1X Run, we were like, well, we love public art. So we sponsor mural festivals all over the world. We're like, let's have our own. And we basically self-funded it because we can do that because we can make decisions on our own. And I know I always talk to Paulina and Sam about, and Ash and John too, about how sometimes you don't have to be dictated by who's going to give you the money. Make it yourself. Do it little bit by little bit. And then you're going to be able to have whatever that you want to do and offer those opportunities to people as well. You can throw your own mural festival or your own mini art fair, and it doesn't take that much. It takes people getting together and really kind of helping each other out to do it.
Well, Detroit Startup Week is a great example of this. This entire week has been entirely volunteer organized and led. So that is a great speaking point to that.
Could I add to that?
That's civil society. You're not doing something because you're being paid for it. You are giving your own time.
Yeah, but on the other hand, I think it's a great idea. If you see something that needs to be created, just create it, and don't wait for anyone else to do it. But on the other hand, I really want to sort of acknowledge and uplift the work of Wage, which is an initiative spearheaded by some folks out of New York that regulates salaries and wages for artists working with nonprofit institutions and traditional institutions who just have a tradition of not paying artists for their work. And so I think it's necessary, as you said, for artists to sort of recognize their own cultural capital. You can't really go out here and expect people to recognize your capital if you're not claiming some funding for your work. Like, your work is valuable, and I think artists, traditionally, we're told artists are not supposed to value their work or put a money tag on their work. Don't ever do it for free, and don't ever do it for exposure. Right, and so it's just like, your whole community by doing that. Yeah, so holding institutions accountable, letting them know, I need to be paid, this is labor that I put into this artwork, and I need to be paid for it, I think is a really important factor for institutions, for gallerists, and for artists to work within that ecosystem of providing an infrastructure. So
yeah. Thank you.
Your value will be felt by not doing it. You know what I mean? Like, someone comes to you and says, hey, blah, 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 and then you'll see, the 2 or 3 people that end up doing the thing you got asked to do, and you're like, oh, you're, the bubble in the ecosystem. I just want to add one more thought on this idea of how do you value art, or how do you create the new metrics. There are all kinds of economic systems that put real-world dollar values on really abstract things, ranging from, hello, startups, like any startup that's ever been evaluated before it made a single dollar, yeah, that's a lot of turning cultural capital into real-world dollars. When you, are in some kind of legal dispute and you suffer emotional damages, there's a mechanism designed to understand what your trauma is worth. In commodity trading, when you're buying a product, or you're buying what oil will be worth a year from now. So there are these mechanisms, but, to use some, startup lingo, how do we hack evaluations for ourselves? How do we more, as the world becomes more decentralized, as the art world becomes more decentralized, how do we create the evaluation mechanisms for individual artists?
Very, very quickly. Yes, there are, but you're also talking about things, one, that are incredibly speculative. There are a lot of people trying to even shut down the idea of the emotional damage, looking at, these are systems that I think for predicting, say, the price of oil. If you had bought in your price of oil 10 years ago, you're in real doo-doo right now. So these are speculative systems. I have one of my dearest friends married a guy who was, an incredibly successful merchant banker by the age of 31. And I remember my wife saying, could you help me, Julian, with my investment? And the first question he asked her was, how much can you afford to lose? And of course, none at all. And he said, then stick it under your bed. I only deal with people who can afford to lose a lot of money, right? They're the ones who are making the type of speculation. I think the broader problem, because there isn't, I think the idea of wage is important. There's a similar argument, for example, about housework that has been there for decades. Selma James, who has been advocating for this for decades. The government is not going to pay it. No American government at any level is going to pay artists for that. What you're therefore left with are entrepreneurial systems. And one of the things that I think that we're talking about here is not social entrepreneurialism, which I completely support, goes, whether it's Uber or what have you, works for individuals, not for communities. And one of the things that I was trying to address is the social and cultural capital of art, which we are all trying to say the prestige of that makes possible the transformation into real capital. But the real significance is not, can individuals work out ways of monetizing art? The real question is, how might this help us to think about different ideas of wealth and equitable access to resources? And I don't see any of that changing unless we have, as a culture, a completely different idea and concept of social wealth. And this is what the decentralization that John is talking about, this is what may be happening. We're in the process of transforming our very idea of leisure of work, and we wait to see whether that will also lead to a different idea of social wealth, because the decentralizing practices that you're talking about, John, have benefited a very small number of people. And we're going to, and the argument now is, how long will that continue to be the case? Because surely it's not sustainable.
Thank you. Okay, so we are nearing close to the half-hour mark, which I want to leave time for questions from the audience. So I'm going to try to get in a few more questions directly to the panelists, and then we will turn it over to you guys. Talking about risk and saying, you know, you don't have anything that you're willing to lose, and so therefore people, you know, may be advised not to make that risk. What does arts intersecting with other sectors look like? What does investment in arts infrastructure in Detroit look like? And what are some of the risk aversions for the investments on that side, like for foundations, grants? Are there alternative funding mechanisms that could be in place or should be here to transfer some of that investment risk into actually funding and catalyzing the industry?
So I'll answer real quick, just on an individual citizen level. So as an artist, one of the things that I learned early on was that no one was going to give me permission to be at certain non-creative or non-art conversations, particularly within city infrastructure and government. So that has been my own individual way of putting art into other sectors' conversations, is being at the table and giving myself permission to be at different city council meetings, on different task forces and different committees. So I think it's one of those things where there's been a lot of talk about the unique role of a creative person, but in getting back to the role of a citizen, I think that I'm personally interested in what's happening at the city level, whether it has to do or it has a label of art or not. I'm interested in sustainability, right? And so as someone who's interested in those things, I'm bringing me to the table, and I come with a lot of different other things. One is a way of thinking creatively. Another is, you know, all the other identities that I have. So I think personally, what I've been able to do is, I mean, it sometimes is unfortunate that I'm the only creative person, you know, at the Green Task Force meeting. But what I've learned is that people are happy to have someone raise their hand and say, well, what is the role of creative people in this? Or have you thought about possibly, you know, doing what Philadelphia is doing and having an artist in residence at the different, you know, city departments, right? So why don't you just, what if there's no one in the room to even raise their hand and ask the question of what does it look like to formalize, if that's what we need to do, an artist's role in city government? What would that look like? Is it enough to just have an artist or two at the table being a human being and therefore saying things that come to their mind, which happens to be a creative mind? Is that a different sort of process than someone who isn't who doesn't label themselves an artist. So I would just say, I mean, take responsibility for what you have access to as a citizen. And if you're a creative person, your ideas will inherently be sort of motivated by that creative spirit.
You have to insert yourself into those conversations.
Can you just repeat the first part of that, the question?
The first part is the risk aversion, like for
yeah.
investment from other sectors.
Yeah, I think, well, I find that argument very, that argument which you come across in a number of different ways, it would just be like a lazy argument, because like there's risk in everything that you do. Like you step outside your door, you know, it's a risk it might rain, there's a risk it might snow, it's a risk you might get both. You know, you go to a restaurant, it's a risk the food may be good or it may not. So I think, you know, just using that, it's like, oh, I don't know if I can get into that art stuff because it's a bit iffy. I think it's a struggle, and to be, you know, that risk averse. There are other ways you can go about it to still provide, you know, capital and enough things to see what can come out of it. I know a lot of the work that people are doing here and the work that people are doing in the room. You know, art can be used for a number of different things. I touched on some of the stuff earlier, whether it's, you know, arts and education, using arts to public safety, arts in, you know, neighborhood development, arts and tourism and stuff. It's always like arts, and there is a number of different ways that you can invest in the arts to help it achieve like a number of different goals. One of the examples that I would like to point to is in Baltimore. They've got an art, I think it's Arts at Work, and which is with the Baltimore Police Department. And they've partnered with a group of artists and are going through creative problem solving. So what they'll do is they'll use get a group of, you know, officers and stuff in the room to say, you know, what is the issue, and then figure out ways to actually demonstrate and act out, you know, the various situation, have a bit of a role playing to say, what are some of the different ways that you can go about it, or what are creative solutions that you can achieve by, and still, you know, make a peaceful resolve to it. And so it's never just like you have to pigeonhole art to just, you know, being a painting or a picture and a drawing. There's multiple uses of art.
It's really interesting because I just had this conversation with an artist. So a lot of famous artists that we see, and I'm not going to name any names, but there's like a handful that are here in the Ashlades, and they're making lots of money and they're doing great things. One of the most revealing things that I found out is that they are backed by a venture capital firm. And the risk has been diverted because they have figured out a way to manipulate the system just the way they manipulate a bank. And happens with lots of art. Most auctions are completely manipulated, right? So where's the risk? The risk can be eliminated if you have, right now there might be somebody in here that's an up and coming artist. You can have 10 very rich people behind you and say, this is what your artwork is worth and we're all gonna buy it. And then they totally inflate what that is. And it just happens. It happens in art, it happens in music. We've seen lots of very famous music people that are not very good. You know what I mean? Like, it happens in all industry, banking and what have you. So there is ways to divert the risk. I think what I always tell collectors when they want to buy a piece of work, and I was like, unless you're buying a $50,000 painting, you should just buy it because you like it. Like, don't buy art because you think someday it's going to be 10 or 20 times the amount. Buy it because you like it. And I guarantee you'll get so much more enjoyment and pleasure out of that piece over the next 20 years. And maybe it'll be worth something more, but at the end of the day, that's what you should focus on. If you want to do art as an investment, yes, go buy a Warhol or a Basquiat, store it, put it away, wait 10 years, see what happens. But unless you're trying to play with money like that, I always recommend people just to buy what they like.
That's a great insight. So I want to just touch on some of the strengths that we do have in the Detroit art community, and this has been touched on briefly, and I think that the key word is collaboration. I've met a lot of artists that have moved here from LA. I work with a lot of people in the community myself, and I think that without collaboration with a capital C in the city, that the ecosystem wouldn't be able to maintain itself without such a strong infrastructure at this point. And I just really wanted to point that out, that the strong point of the Detroit arts community or communities is that the word community and collaboration are hand in hand and really are what make a lot of the work that people do right now here possible. I also want to point out the elephant in the room is that the city does not at the moment have an arts council, which a lot of other cities do. And some of the things that art councils do for cities, just to be clear, include strategic and vision planning for the sector. They have re-granting public funds. They do advocacy and policy work. They assist neighborhoods with development and also help to create cultural districts. They help to facilitate public art. It catalyzes relationships between stakeholders, and it's really a visionary and magnetic entity within the city structure that is the glue, which I think is somewhat obviously just not present in the city at the moment, which may be changing.
In all honesty, I don't, until we get like probably new government in office, we're not going to see that. We have elected officials in office right now that do not value what it is to be an artist or a creative. And it could go from person to person, but as it is right now, I've been having lots of really intense conversations with like city officials that are going in and ticketing business owners and graffiti or public art or like just like having like an open dialogue with them. And I was like, do you guys know that people are moving to Detroit for art? Do you know that they know us about? I'm
convinced that I want a city council controlled arts. I'm absolutely not there.
Well, that's what I was saying is that the binding of this community is the binding of the community is what needs to compel.
Correct. Yes. Yeah.